This is a movie that I've been looking forward to for a while, pretty much ever since it was first announced. I grew up on the original, having seen it dozens of times, and almost all of the claymation stories from Aardman Studios are very good. Chicken Run 2: Dawn of the Nugget follows the same set of characters that we met in the first film. After having escaped from the farm, the chickens have settled on an island where they live a safe and undisturbed life. Ginger and Rocky even welcome in a daughter of their own, Molly. However, Mrs. Tweedy is back with a new idea: nuggets. And when Molly's curiosity and rebellious nature get the best of her, the chickens have to adventure to the mainland and rescue Molly before she gets turned into lunch. Much like the first film, this isn't necessarily a movie that's meant to be taken seriously. Beyond the obvious fantastical elements to the story, like chickens breaking into a factory and shooting off fireworks, there are definitely some moments where logic has to be suspended. There are some moments to the movie where it makes you step back and think, really? Did I really just see that happen? They weren't often, but this definitely isn't a story that you're going to pick apart piece by piece. It's meant more for a fun time than to win any awards. There were also some moments where the timing of the scene and the cuts really drew out the moment longer than it should have. The specific point that comes to mind is at the climax, when the brainwashed chickens are about to go off the conveyor belt and get turned into food. Ginger's holding the button, Molly's about to get axed, Rocky's up on top about to swing down. And as the camera goes from character to character, trying its best to raise the tension and get us on the edge of our seats, it just felt like it went on forever, to the point where I was losing interest in the scene. Now, I'm not going to act like I'm the intended audience for the movie. A moment like this would probably go over a lot better with a bunch of 10-year-olds who are genuinely worried about the characters. I've seen enough movies, I know how this is going to end. So I naturally have a lot less patience for something like this. But I still do think a better job could have been done pacing-wise, really throughout the whole movie, to make it flow better and keep all audiences focused on the movie. As much as I hate myself for it, there were multiple times where, watching this at my desk, I picked up my phone and began to scroll through stuff on there, because I was losing interest in the movie. The real villain herself that was teased at in all the trailers wasn't even introduced until halfway through. Now, I'm not sure how this compares to what the first movie did, and the story did have somewhat of an antagonist presence with the presence of Dr. Fry, who's initially portrayed it to be much more menacing than he actually is. But even the big Nugget Farm reveal doesn't happen until late into the second half. As an audience, we can predict what's going to happen. We know that this place isn't as nice as it seems, and there are some hints added along the way. But for a younger audience that wouldn't anticipate any of this, I think the story does take a bit too long to get to the larger problem. There's the initial conflict between Molly and her parents, which I'll get into more later, but when talking about the overarching story, much of it is saved for the last half hour or so of the movie, part of the reason I think the pacing was on the weaker side. But when it came to Mrs. Tweedy herself, she was just as good as she was in the first movie. A great presence, although much more limited than I anticipated. She's proven to be a threat, fun to watch, a scary, looming figure with an attitude, the same person we know from the original. And although it felt like it was briefly referred to, the connections to the original movie were nice too, like the chickens recognizing her voice, the flashbacks to the terrors of the farm, and then Tweedy concluding Molly was Ginger's daughter. But establishing the history between those two forces, it nicely paid homage to the original without leaning too heavily on it. Although it is a sequel, this is absolutely one of those where someone could watch this movie on its own and still understand and enjoy it. There are moments that are made better by having seen the original, and some details that would seem a bit far-fetched without that knowledge, like the extensive security for the singular factory. But having seen the original, we know Mrs. Tweedy and what happened to her, and it adds a little bit of comedy to it all. The humor was definitely one of the strong points of the movie, especially because I know it's aimed at a younger audience and has a more lighthearted nature. Anytime the comedy didn't hit, it didn't bother me all that much, but for the most part, it always served its intended purpose. There are some jokes that reference the original movie, there's a variance of the Mission Impossible theme as the chickens are breaking into the factory, and a lot of other simple pieces of comedy infused into the story and dialogue. And all of the characters are once again a blast to follow along with. You've got the main side characters, Mac, Babs, Bunty, Fowler, none of which get too much to do, but they have their moments. Bunty and Babs were on screen a lot, but it really didn't feel like they made too much of an impact other than being there, and one fun moment where they take down a security guard. Mac had a little more to do, mainly because he was the one with all of the gear. Fowler was pretty much the opposite, where he wasn't on screen much, but whenever he was, it felt like he was doing something meaningful to the story, or adding comedy to it. Nick and Fetcher, the two rats, were great as always, a joy to watch, especially their reaction to being called Uncle by Molly. Family is a big theme in the movie, revolving around Ginger, Rocky, and Molly, and then everyone else filling that kind of distant relative role. It didn't feel like the theme of family was given the spotlight often, really only a few times here or there throughout the movie, but because it's what the entire story is based on, it does still feel important. Molly runs away because Ginger is holding on to her too tight, being too protective. Ginger calls her brave, but she doesn't act like she believes it. But eventually she has to back up those words and let Molly fight for herself and participate in the mission. Ginger is an overprotective mother, and the other side of that coin is Molly's adolescent rebellion, which for many people may be more relatable. The two characters are shown to be so different and yet so similar, Molly taking after her mother in so many different ways. It may not be top-tier character work, but it was one of the highlights of the movie for me. Something that I also made a note of was that the name Molly sounded familiar from the first movie. I couldn't find anything, but I'm going to have to remember it on a rewatch, because it would be a nice memoriam for Ginger to name her daughter after somebody that died during the escape. What did you think of Dawn of the Nugget? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like the video, and subscribe for more movie reviews. And remember to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Thank you all for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you. Always.